It began with a single copper plate misplaced in the archives of a municipal basement in Lower Manhattan. Not a grand monument, not a gold-leafed tome, just a small, corroded rectangle of metal that listed a street name no longer found on any map of the 5 boroughs. The name was Lycurgus Row. To the modern eye, it is simply a stretch of asphalt and glass, a nondescript artery of commerce near the financial district. But the plate was dated 1879. By 1881, the name had vanished, replaced by a generic numerical designation. Ask yourself why a city in the throes of an industrial boom would pause its expansion to systematically scrub a name from its ledger, not for ease of navigation, not for urban renewal, for something else. This was the first thread I pulled, expecting a simple story of bureaucratic streamlining. Instead, the fabric of the 19th century began to unravel in my hands. I found the same anomaly in Chicago, in San Francisco, in London. A sudden synchronized spasm of renaming that occurred almost exclusively between 1880 and 1885. It was as if a global memo had been issued, a quiet command to bury a specific vernacular under a layer of fresh, sterile ink. What were we meant to forget? We are told that history is a steady accumulation of facts, a brick-by-brick construction of the past. But what if history is actually a process of selective demolition? Look at the maps, study the load distribution of the buildings that once stood in these renamed districts. They do not match the primitive technology of the era. They speak of a sophisticated architectural language, granite foundations that sink deeper than the official blueprints allow, ornate ironwork that serves no decorative purpose but suggests a mastery of atmospheric electricity. They call it Tartarian, a stylistic flourish, the academics say, a fad. But you don't erase a fad with such clinical precision. You erase a threat. The silence is the loudest piece of evidence. If you walk through the districts once known by these forgotten names, you feel the weight of the erasure. The stone is too heavy, the ceilings are too high, the proportions are designed for a humanity we are no longer permitted to be. In Philadelphia, the district once known as the Saffron Quarter disappeared from the tax rolls in 1882. It wasn't burned, it wasn't demolished, it was simply renamed, and its history was retrofitted to fit the narrative of a colonial settlement. But the foundations tell a different story. They are made of geopolymer, a substance that shouldn't have existed in a world of horse-drawn carriages and gas lamps. The institutional gatekeeping is relentless. Try to access the original land deeds from the 1870s and you will find they have been digitized and the originals lost to water damage. This is the pattern. The anomaly becomes the rule. The local becomes the global. We are living in the ruins of a civilization that was dismantled while our ancestors watched and then told to call the rubble progress. Ask yourself, who benefits from a world without roots? Who gains when the physical record of our predecessors is replaced by a sanitized numerical grid? Not the people, not the artists, someone else. Someone who understands that if you control the name of a place, you control the memory of what happened there. You control the frequency of the ground itself. I travelled to the archives of the Great Exhibition. I looked for the blueprints of the temporary palaces that were said to have been built of wood and plaster, only to be burned or torn down months later. What I found were photographs of structures that defied the engineering capabilities of the time. Vast domes that spanned hundreds of feet without internal supports, spires that glowed without visible fuel, and then I found the lists. The districts surrounding these exhibition sites were the first to be renamed. It was a baptism of fire and ink. The old names that resonated with a different understanding of physics and heritage, were cast into the furnace. In their place, we received the names of industrialists, generals, and politicians, the conquerors renaming the conquered territory. But this wasn't a war between nations, it was a war against time, a war against a specific type of knowledge that was embedded in the very street signs and neighbourhood boundaries of the old world. If you look at the masonry in the renamed districts of St. Louis, you see the marks, strange, rhythmic indentations in the stone that match the resonance patterns of low-frequency sound. Not masonry, not decoration, technology. We are told these buildings are neoclassical, a desperate attempt by 19th century architects to mimic the Greeks. But the Greeks didn't have load-bearing steel hidden inside their marble. The Greeks didn't build sub-basements that connect to subterranean tunnels spanning entire cities. What if the Great Fire of Chicago wasn't an accident? What if the fires that swept through almost every major Western city between 1870 and 1890 were not tragedies, but urban clearances? The renaming followed the smoke. First, the fire levelled the old structures. Then, the renaming obscured the identity of the survivors. Finally, the history books were rewritten to explain why the new buildings looked so much more primitive than the ones they replaced. It is a reversal of the traditional evolutionary narrative. We are moving backward, told we are moving forward. Consider the infrastructure of the renamed Tartarian districts. In every instance, the sewage systems, the water pipes, and the telegraph lines were laid over an existing network of much greater complexity. The new masters didn't build, they inhabited. They moved into the shells of a superior culture and claimed the credit. To ensure the lie took hold, they had to change the labels. They had to break the psychic link between the people and the land. If you call a place Ward 4 instead of the resonance fields, you change the way people think about the ground beneath their feet. You turn a temple into a commodity. You turn a legacy into a debt. The evidence is hidden in plain sight, tucked away in the footnotes of architectural journals and the margins of census reports. In 1884, a surveyor in Boston noted that the old foundations of the newly designated North Point district were resistant to standard excavation techniques. He wrote that the stone seemed to vibrate when struck. His report was suppressed. The district was renamed. The surveyor disappeared from the public record. This is not a conspiracy of shadows. It is a conspiracy of systems. It is the steady, grinding machinery of institutional erasure. They don't need to burn every book if they can just change the names of the chapters. By the time the next generation comes of age, the old world is a myth, a fairy tale told by the senile. But the stones remember. The load distribution doesn't lie. The weight of the past is still there, pressing down on the modern world, causing cracks in the narrative. Why were the districts renamed? Because the names were the keys to the locks, and someone decided that we were no longer allowed to see what was inside the room. If you study the demographics of these renamed districts, a chilling pattern emerges. The populations were often displaced or reorganized shortly after the name change. In the 1880s, the concept of the insane asylum exploded in popularity. These institutions were often housed in the very buildings that defied explanation, massive, sprawling complexes with architectural features that suggest they were once power plants or centers of healing. Many of the people who lived in the Tartarian districts, those who remembered the old names and the old ways, were moved into these asylums. It was a masterstroke of institutional gatekeeping. If you remember the truth, you are mad. If you accept the lie, you are a productive citizen, not a prison, not a hospital, something else, a storage facility for the inconvenient witnesses of a vanished era. Ask yourself why the census of 1880 is so fraught with errors and adjustments. Why were thousands of people in these specific districts suddenly listed as transient or unknown? They were being erased along with their neighbourhoods. The renaming was the final nail in the coffin. It made the erasure permanent. The language used in the official decrees of the time is hauntingly rhythmic. It speaks of uniformity, modernization, and the elimination of archaic nomenclature. It is the language of a conqueror, but it is delivered with the staccato precision of an accountant. They were balancing the books of history. They were clearing the ledger of any debt to the past. In San Francisco, the renaming occurred just as the city was being rebuilt after the 1880 tremors, events that preceded the Great Fire but served the same purpose. The districts that were renamed were the ones where the old world architecture remained most intact. These were the areas where the street layouts followed the ley lines of the earth, not the grid of a developer. By imposing the grid, they broke the flow. They neutralized the power of the architecture. It is a form of geomantic warfare. If you change the geometry of a city, you change the consciousness of its inhabitants. You make them easier to lead. You make them forget that they were once something more than workers in a hive. Consider the role of the world's fairs. We are taught they were celebrations of human progress, ephemeral wonderlands that showcase the future. But look at the dates. They coincide perfectly with the periods of renaming and reconstruction. The fairs were the funeral pyres of the Tartarian world. They built a temporary city around the permanent ruins, then burned it all down to explain why the ruins were gone. It was a shell game on a global scale. The districts renamed in the wake of these fairs were often the most technologically advanced parts of the city. In Omaha, in Buffalo, in Chicago, the pattern repeats with unsettling regularity. The names that were lost were often descriptive of the functions of the districts: the etheric quarter, the radiant plains, the sounding harbour. They were replaced by names like the industrial zone or the fourth ward. The poetry of function was replaced by the prose of control. Not an accident, not a coincidence, a strategy. I found a map in a private collection in Zurich. It was a map of the world as it was understood in 1875. It didn't show nations as we know them. It showed networks. It showed districts of resonance and hubs of atmospheric energy. And the names were universal. A district in Moscow had the same name as a district in Rio de Janeiro because they served the same purpose in a global system of energy distribution. By 1885, that map was obsolete. The renaming had carved the world into isolated pockets. It had severed the connections. The global pattern was broken, replaced by a series of localized, manageable fictions. This is the institutional erasure at its most profound. It didn't just happen in one city, it happened everywhere, all at once. A worldwide system of memory holding that was so successful we don't even know we've lost anything. We look at the old buildings and think they are beautiful, but we don't realize they are the amputated limbs of a giant. The philosophical implications are staggering. If the world was renamed in the 1880s, who are we? We are the children of the renamed. We are the inheritors of a fragmented identity. We live in districts that are designated by numbers and dead men's names, walking over foundations we don't understand, through streets that were designed for a different frequency of life. The unresolved loop remains. If they could erase the names of our cities, What else have they erased? What parts of our own nature were renamed to make us more compliant? Not this, not that, something else. We are the ghosts in a machine that we were told we built, but which we are actually only haunting. The renaming wasn't just about geography, it was about the soul. And the 1880s were the decade the soul of the world was rebranded. The architecture of the 1880s is a silent confession. If you look at the post-1880 municipal buildings in the renamed districts of the Midwest, you see a sudden degradation in stone quality, a loss of harmonic proportion. The transition is abrupt, not a gradual evolution of style, a severance. Before the renaming, the structures utilized heavy load distribution systems that seemed to defy the soil density reports of the period. They used red brick not merely as a colonial aesthetic, but as a semiconductor layered with iron oxide to interact with the atmospheric charge. Ask yourself why the Great Renaming was accompanied by the systematic removal of metal finials from the rooftops of these districts. They told us they were lightning rods. They told us they were ornaments. They were something else. They were the antennas of a wireless grid that served the Tartarian districts before the meter was invented. When the districts were renamed, the hardware was stripped. The antennas were melted down. The narrative was sanitized. To keep the energy, you must keep the name. To lose the name is to lose the connection to the source. We are told the 1880s were a time of discovery. Yet every major invention of that decade, the light bulb, the phonograph, the transformer, was a crude, metered imitation of a free access system that had existed for centuries. The renaming was the legal framework for this theft. It turned a planetary utility into private property. In the archives of the British Library, there is a series of ledgers from the East India Company that were never meant for public eyes. They describe topographical recalibrations in the colonial territories, but the language is identical to the municipal records of New York and Chicago from the same years. The term Tartarian appears in the margins of an 1882 Surveyor's map of Calcutta, circled in red ink with a single word written beside it: extinguish, not replace, not update. Extinguish. This is the institutional erasure in its purest form. It is the clinical removal of a global identity. The renaming of the districts in India mirrored the renaming of the districts in the American West. The black town and white town designations were not just racial, they were vibrational. They separated the populations who still understood the ancient resonance of the land from those who were being trained to live in the new artificial grid. What if the history of the 19th century is not a story of progress, but a story of a global coup d'etat, a silent takeover by a group of architects and bankers who realized that the old world was too free, too connected, and too powerful to be controlled? So they renamed it. They burned the parts they couldn't use and labelled the rest as Victorian. Think about the old world basements. In every renamed district, from Philadelphia to Prague, the first floors of the oldest buildings are buried. We are told this was due to mud strikes or street levelling to improve drainage. Ask yourself, does a civilization bury its finest stonework, its ornate arched windows, and its grand entranceways just to avoid a puddle? Not this, not that, something else. The renaming of the districts served to hide the fact that the street level had been artificially raised to hide the true scale of the previous civilization's infrastructure. In the renamed Lower District of Seattle, The underground city is a labyrinth of high-tech masonry that puts the modern skyscrapers to shame. When they renamed the area, they legalized the burial. They turned the ground floor into a basement and the second floor into a new beginning. They literally built a lie on top of a truth, and then they gave the lie a new name so we would never think to dig. The rhythmic sentence of history is being rewritten in real time. We see it today in the gentrification of our cities, which is merely a modern echo of the 1880s renaming. A neighbourhood is rebranded. The old inhabitants are pushed out. The history of the place is scrubbed and replaced by a lifestyle brand. But in the 1880s, the scale was total. It was the gentrification of the planet. In the renamed districts of Paris, the Haussmann renovations are celebrated as a triumph of urban planning. But look at the maps of the pre-1880 quarters. They were patterns of sacred geometry designed to amplify human cognition and health. Haussmann broke those patterns. He replaced the Tartarian flow with straight lines and wide boulevards, not for beauty, but for cannon fire, for control. The renaming of the arrondissements was the final step in turning a living organism into a barracks. We are the inmates of a grand design we can no longer read because we have forgotten the alphabet. In 1886, a patent was filed for a method of historical synchronization. It was quickly bought by a consortium of railway magnates and buried. The patent described a way to use the standardized time zones introduced in 1883 to coordinate the renaming of districts across the globe. It was about synchronization. If everyone forgets at the same time, no one can remind their neighbor of what was lost. The renaming was a global system restore that wiped the hard drive of human memory. We are the files that survived the crash, but our pathways have been renamed. We are shortcut to new world, but the target file has been deleted. The staccato beat of the industrial hammer was the soundtrack to this erasure. Clang. Rename. Clang. Erase. Clang. Forget. I found a photograph from 1878 of a district in St. Petersburg that no longer exists on any map. The buildings are translucent, not glass, not stone, something else. They seem to be vibrating. The caption calls the area the etheric quarter. By 1881, the same street was photographed again. The buildings are now opaque, covered in heavy grey stone and scaffoldings. The name on the street sign has been changed to Alexander Nevsky Street. The transition is visible. It is the cooling of a high-frequency culture into a low-frequency prison. The renaming was the official declaration of the freeze. It was the moment the music stopped and the silence of the modern world began. We are living in the static. Ask yourself why the Tartarian style, the so-called Beaux-Arts or neoclassical, is the only style used for every seat of power on earth, from the capital in DC to the parliaments of Europe and the palaces of Russia. If it was just a fad, why is it the universal language of authority? Because those buildings were not built by the people currently occupying them. They were the administrative hubs of the previous global system. They were kept because they were too powerful to destroy, but they were renamed to hide their origin. They are the captured flags of a defeated civilization. Every time you see a domed Capitol building in a renamed district, you are looking at a piece of stolen technology. The institutional gatekeeping extends even to our language. The word Tartary was scrubbed from the encyclopedias starting in the late 19th century. It went from being a recognized empire on every map to being a vague geographical term for a wasteland. This is the erasure trope in its most clinical application. First, you take the land, then you take the name, finally, you take the definition. And by 1890, the word was a ghost. By 1920, it was a joke. Today, it is conspiracy theory. This is how the loop closes. If you can make the truth sound ridiculous, you don't need to hide it anymore. You can leave it right in the middle of the renamed district and no one will ever see it. The load distribution of our current reality is unstable. It is built on a foundation of false names and stolen stone. We feel it in the tension of our modern lives, a sense that something is profoundly wrong, that the world we inhabit is a cheap imitation of a much grander reality. We are like orphans living in a mansion, told that our parents were peasants and that the house was built by the people who now charge us rent. The renaming of the 1880s was the moment the locks were changed, but the keys are still there, hidden in the old names, the old blueprints, and the rhythmic patterns of the stone. What if the renaming never stopped? What if the 1880s were just the first phase? As I sit in this archive, looking at the digital maps of the 21st century, I see the same patterns, the new districts, the innovation hubs, the smart cities. The names are different, but the purpose is the same: to sever the connection, to obscure the past, to prepare us for the next system restore. The investigative essayist becomes the urban explorer, and the urban explorer becomes the fugitive, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You become an anomaly in their grid, a name they haven't changed yet, a thread they haven't pulled. The philosophical open loop remains: are we the investigators, or are we the evidence? Not this, not that, something else. The 19th century did not end with a whimper. It ended with a massive, coordinated structural silencing. In the renamed districts of the American Midwest, the year 1887 marked the peak of the Great Leveling. Not a natural disaster, not an economic crash, something else. It was the year the municipal improvement boards were granted absolute authority to overwrite the existing reality. In the city of Cincinnati, an entire neighborhood once referred to as the etheric fold was redesignated as the 10th Ward. The local chronicles from the months preceding the change describe a strange, pervasive hum that emanated from the very cobblestones, a frequency that supposedly regulated the health and temperament of the inhabitants. After the renaming, the stones were pulled up and replaced with dull, non-resonant granite. The hum stopped. The people grew sickly. The history was rewritten to claim the area had always been a slum. Ask yourself, why does progress always seem to require the destruction of something superior? Why must the modern world be built on the bones of a more harmonious past? The institutional gatekeeping is so thorough that we consider the lack of evidence to be proof of the myth. But the absence of a record is itself a record. It is the footprint of the eraser. Consider the phenomenon of the star forts. These massive, geometrically perfect stone bastions are found on every continent, usually positioned at the heart of the districts that underwent the most radical renaming in the 1880s. We are told they are defensive fortifications built by colonial powers to repel cannon fire. But look at the load distribution. Look at the fractal mathematics embedded in their layout. A cannon is a primitive tool of destruction. These forts are sophisticated tools of stabilization. They are the circuit boards of the earth. When the districts were renamed, these forts were either buried, turned into prisons, or labeled as follies. In the renamed Harbor District of New York, the fort known as Castle Clinton was stripped of its internal mechanisms and turned into an aquarium. Not a defense, not a decoration, something else. It was a power hub for the Tartarian grid, neutralized and rebranded to serve a narrative of entertainment rather than empowerment. The renaming was the legal shroud placed over the corpse of a global energy system. What if the renaming was actually a form of spiritual and technological decommissioning? In the winter of 1888, a series of fires broke out in the patent offices of three major capitals, Washington, London, and St. Petersburg. Thousands of blueprints for unconventional machinery were lost. These were the designs for the devices that occupied the renamed districts, the machines that functioned without coal, without steam, without the exploitation of labour. Immediately following these fires, the renaming process accelerated. It was as if the physical evidence and the linguistic evidence had to be destroyed in tandem. If the machine no longer exists and the name of the place where it stood has been changed, how can anyone prove it ever was? This is the rhythmic cycle of the erasure. Burn the map, rename the street, rewrite the book, repeat until the collective memory is a blank slate. The staccato beat of the typewriter replaced the resonance of the old world. We are living in a world of carbon copies, where the original has been shredded and used as insulation for the new walls. The scale of the renaming suggests a centralized command that transcends national borders. How did the mayors of Chicago and the prefects of Paris and the governors of Tokyo all decide, within the same 5-year window, that their historic districts needed to be renamed according to a numerical or commemorative system? This is not the organic growth of cities. This is a deployment. It is the tactical application of a new reality. In the renamed districts of Tokyo, the old water lords were replaced by industrial managers. The canals, which once functioned as a hydraulic energy network, were filled with the rubble of the old temples and paved over. The new names reflected the new industry, but the foundations of the modern skyscrapers still rest on the massive interlocking stones of the Tartarian era, stones that the 19th century engineers admitted they could not move, so they simply built on top of them and changed the address. Look at the census data from 1890. In the renamed districts, there is a statistical impossibility: the Great Disappearance. Thousands of skilled craftsmen, masons, glassblowers, metalsmiths, who understood the old technology, simply vanish from the rolls. They are not listed as deceased. They are not listed as emigrated. They are just gone. At the same time, the new history books begin to appear in the newly renamed schools. These books teach a simplified, linear version of a human achievement. They teach that we are at the pinnacle of history, but the architecture of the renamed districts mocks this claim. It stands as a silent witness to a height we have yet to reclaim. The staccato rhythm of the modern clock is a countdown to a destination we've already passed. We are the amnesiacs of the Industrial Revolution, wandering through a museum we think is a home. In the renamed Grand Circus district of Detroit, the subterranean tunnels were found to be lined with a ceramic material that glows under specific acoustic frequencies. The 1880 renaming of the area coincided with the sealing of these tunnels with concrete. The official reason was public safety. The real reason was the erasure of a legacy. If the public cannot see the tunnels and they no longer call the area by its original functional name, the secret is safe. The institutional gatekeeping is a multi-layered defense. It uses the law, the fire, the stone, and the word. It is a total war on the past. Ask yourself, if the history of your city is a lie, what does that say about your own identity? Are you a citizen of a nation or a tenant in a renamed ruin? The investigative essayist finds that the deeper one digs, the more the language of the 1880s reveals its true intent. The use of standardization was a weapon. By standardizing the names, they categorized the world into taxable units. They removed the irregularity of the Tartarian districts, which was actually the individuality of the human spirit. The renaming was the first step in the digitization of reality. It turned the messy, beautiful resonant world into a series of coordinates. It made the world legible to the machine, and the machine does not care for heritage. It only cares for load distribution and efficiency. We are the components of a system that renamed us human resources while we were still dreaming of being souls. In the shadows of the renamed districts, the urban explorer finds the orphaned stones. These are blocks of masonry that don't fit the new grid. They are often found in the corners of parks or the foundations of bridges, carved with symbols that no longer have a meaning in our modern lexicon. They are the survivors of the renaming. If you touch them, they feel colder than the surrounding stone, or warmer. They possess a thermal anomaly that science refuses to investigate. This is the forbidden knowledge that the 1880s sought to bury. The knowledge that matter and energy are not separate, that the name of a place is a frequency, that by changing the name you change the physical properties of the space. Not magic, not myth, something else. A lost science of resonance that was silenced by the staccato noise of the factory. The philosophical open loop widens. If the renaming was a global event, then the history of the entire world is a coordinated fiction. The 1880s were the birth of the world order we now take for granted. It was the moment the diverse, high-frequency cultures of the Tartarian era were crushed into a single, low-frequency monoculture. The districts were renamed to mark the boundaries of the new cages. We walk the streets of these cages every day, never realizing that the bars are made of words and the locks are made of forgotten names. The investigation leads not to a conclusion, but to a confrontation with the fact that we are living in a renamed reality, and the original name is the only thing that can set us free. As the light fades on this section of the archive, I am struck by a final, unsettling thought. The renaming didn't just happen to the streets and the districts, it happened to our ancestors. The great renaming of the 1880s coincides with the massive wave of immigration, where millions of people were given new names at ports of entry. Their old identities, their old lineages, their old connections to the Tartarian world were stripped away. They were renamed to fit the new districts. They were made compatible with the new grid. We are the descendants of the renamed, living in renamed houses on renamed streets, wondering why we feel so lost. The staccato beat of the heart is the only thing that remembers the original rhythm. Not this, not that, something else. The transition from the 19th century's middle years to its closing decades was marked by a clinical, architectural lobotomy. In the renamed districts of the American South, specifically in the coastal hubs of Savannah and Charleston, the records of 1889 reveal a sudden and unexplained consolidation of municipal identity. Neighborhoods that had stood for generations under names that evoked the celestial or the alchemical, the solstice court, the meridian rise, were abruptly overwritten with the names of local magistrates and cotton merchants. But the renaming was merely the surface of the wound. Beneath the new street signs, the very soil was being re-engineered. Excavation reports from the era, often buried in the miscellaneous files of state engineering offices, described the discovery of copper-lined conduits running beneath the renamed streets. These were not sewers. They were not gas lines. They were something else. They were waveguides for a terrestrial energy that had been harvested by the original Tartarian planners. When the districts were renamed, these conduits were filled with sand and liquid lead. The institutional gatekeeping of the historical record insists this was for structural stability. Ask yourself, why would an expanding city spend millions to neutralise a pre-existing infrastructure? Not to improve, not to modernise, to silence. The staccato rhythm of the 1900s began with the final breath of the 1880s. In the renamed civic centres of the world, from Melbourne to Montreal, the architecture of the previous era was subjected to a curious process of facadism. The grand, ornate structures were stripped of their internal mechanics, their vaulted ceilings lowered with false plaster, and their resonant stone halls partitioned into cramped, efficient offices. The renaming was the bureaucratic seal on this transformation. By calling a palace a Bureau of Land Management, you change the way the mind perceives the space. You collapse the infinite into the mundane. In the renamed districts of San Francisco, following the tremors that the history books claim occurred in 1880, the reconstruction was actually a deconstruction. The buildings that had survived the vibrations were those with specific harmonic proportions. These were the buildings that were most aggressively targeted for renaming and structural modification. The new names were sterile, often just letters and numbers, a linguistic cage for a wild reality. The erasure trope is at its most effective when it is most boring. We do not question the name 6th Street because it lacks the power to provoke a question, and that is exactly the point. Consider the foundling hospitals that proliferated in the renamed districts during this period. We are told of a crisis of abandoned children, a byproduct of industrial poverty, but the numbers do not add up. In the 1880s, the population of these institutions exploded in the very districts where the names were being changed most rapidly. What if these children were not abandoned, but were the displaced survivors of a cultural reset? A generation without names, being raised in renamed buildings to be the first citizens of a rewritten history. This is the institutional erasure of the future itself. In the renamed industrial corridor of Manchester, the schools that replaced the old Tartarian academies focused on a staccato curriculum of repetition and obedience. The pseudo-academic language of the new textbooks omitted any mention of atmospheric energy or the geopolymer masonry of the surrounding streets. The children were taught that their ancestors lived in squalor and that the grand buildings they saw every day were the miraculous, sudden inventions of a few visionary businessmen. They were taught to be grateful for their own amnesia. The low distribution of truth is being shifted onto the shoulders of the investigators who dare to look at the foundations. In the renamed districts of Cairo, the modernization efforts of 1884 led to the renaming of the quarters surrounding the great mosques. The new names were European, designed to reflect the enlightenment of the occupiers. But the underground surveys of the time, conducted by military engineers, showed that the mosques and the surrounding residential districts were built on a single, continuous plate of basalt that resonated at a specific frequency. When the names were changed, the water projects of the colonial administration diverted the natural flow of the Nile, flooding the subterranean chambers and dampening the resonance. The renaming was the psychological anchor for the physical destruction. It told the people that their past was dead, even as the buildings themselves remained. The investigative essayist must ask, what if the dead buildings are merely dormant? What if the names are the incantations required to wake them? In the renamed Harbour View district of Boston, a peculiar document was found in 1891 behind a false wall in a decommissioned customs house. It was a list of original designations for the entire eastern seaboard. The names were not English, they were not Dutch, they were a series of mathematical coordinates paired with phonetic sounds that resembled no known language. This is the global pattern expanding. The renaming of the 1880s was not just about local pride or political control. It was about the systematic replacement of a cosmic language with a transactional one. We are told that the districts were renamed for the sake of clarity, but the result was a profound confusion. We no longer know where we are because we no longer know what the land is for. Not this, not that. Something else. The land was a machine, and the name was the operating manual. By changing the manual, they made the machine inaccessible to the very people who lived inside it. The staccato sentences of the census takers in 1880 reflected a world in flux. In the renamed districts of Chicago, the census records show thousands of unoccupied residences that were clearly inhabited in the photographs of the same period. This is institutional gatekeeping through statistical omission. If you don't count the people, they don't exist. If they don't exist, their memories of the old names don't exist. The renaming was the final step in this process of making the inconvenient invisible. In the renamed Victory Park of a small town in Ohio, the central monument is a statue of a Civil War general. But if you look at the base of the statue, the stone is older, carved with a different type of tool, and features a load distribution that suggests it once supported something much heavier than a man on a horse. The general's name is the lie that protects the truth of the stone. The renaming of the park in 1885 was the moment the original purpose of the site was officially lost. Ask yourself why the great renaming was so often accompanied by the establishment of public libraries in the renamed districts. We think of libraries as centres of knowledge, but in the 1880s they served as the distribution points for the new narrative. They were the filters through which the past had to pass. If a book mentioned the old names, if it spoke of the Tartarian districts as anything other than a stylistic phase, it was not included in the new collections. The institutional erasure was not a burning of books, but a drowning of books in a sea of irrelevant information. The staccato noise of the new press, the constant news of the 1880s served to distract the public from the silent loss of their heritage. We are the inheritors of that noise. We are the children of the distraction. The investigative essayist finds that the renaming was also a form of financial recoding. In the renamed financial districts of London and New York, the property deeds were reorganized under new titles in the 1880s. This allowed for the legal seizure of Tartarian infrastructure by newly formed corporations. The old names carried with them communal rights and ancient protections. The new names, the stockyard district, the textile zone, reduced the land to a single function. It was the commodification of the earth. The renaming was the terms and conditions that no one read, but everyone signed. By 1890, the world had been sold to a group of men who had changed the names of the streets so they could change the owners of the world. Not a transition, a transaction. The rhythmic pulse of the old world still beats beneath the renamed districts of San Francisco. In the areas once known for their healing fountains, the new names reflect the sterile world of commerce. But the water still flows, the pipes still hum. The urban explorer who ventures into the lower levels of the renamed districts finds that the architecture is not static. It reacts to the presence of human consciousness. It is as if the buildings are waiting for someone to call them by their true names. The renaming was a gag order, but the silence is starting to break. The staccato rhythm of the modern world is failing to keep the ancient melody suppressed. We are living in the pause between the lie and the realization. The philosophical open loop of the 1880s renaming leads us to a terrifying question. If we were to reclaim the old names, would the old world return? Is the reality we inhabit merely a linguistic construct, a renamed version of a much more powerful existence? The investigation is no longer about history, it is about the nature of our current perception. We are the investigators of our own prison. We are the ones looking for the keys that were hidden in plain sight in the very names of the places where we sleep. Not this, not that, something else. We are the voice of the renamed, finally beginning to speak. The transition from the fluid, organic mapping of the mid-19th century to the rigid Cartesian grids of the 1880s was not a matter of convenience, but a matter of containment. In the renamed districts of Berlin, the records of 1884 show a sudden obsession with the normalization of street widths and building heights. Districts that had once been known for their labyrinthine, resonant alleys, areas that fostered a high-frequency, decentralized community, were renamed and re-engineered into the Kaiser's quadrants. The staccato rhythm of the Prussian march was imposed upon the stone itself. Ask yourself why the institutional gatekeeping of the time was so focused on the elimination of the curve, not for traffic, not for light, something else, the curve, the spiral, the fractal. These are the geometries of the Tartarian world. They are the shapes that amplify atmospheric charge. By renaming the districts and straightening the streets, the new masters of the 1880s flattened the energy potential of the city. They turned a living battery into a graveyard of right angles. The global pattern of renaming in the 1880s reveals a profound skepticism of authority among the few who dared to document it. In the free ports of Southeast Asia, specifically in the districts surrounding Singapore and Hong Kong, the renaming process was used to hide the true age of the maritime infrastructure, the massive granite docks and the subterranean dry docks, structures that show no signs of the primitive construction techniques attributed to the colonial era, were given English names in 1882. They were labelled as Victorian engineering marvels, despite the lack of blueprints or construction records. The institutional erasure was so complete that the local populations began to believe they had arrived at an empty shore. But the load distribution of the piers suggests they were designed for vessels far larger and more sophisticated than the wooden ships of the 19th century. The renaming was the legal anchor for a grand theft of heritage. We are told the British built the world, but the evidence in the renamed districts suggests they simply moved into it and changed the signs. Consider the fire insurance maps of the 1880s. These documents are often used by historians to prove the existence of buildings, but they also reveal the systematic deletion of Tartarian districts. In the Sanborn maps of 1885, we see entire blocks in the renamed Market District of New Orleans that are marked with a single cryptic label, non-conforming. Shortly after this designation, the districts were renamed, the buildings were modernized, and the non-conforming features, the atmospheric spires, the copper-infused bricks, the subterranean resonance chambers, were removed. The institutional gatekeeping of the insurance industry was a primary tool of the erasure. If a building was non-conforming, it could not be insured. If it could not be insured, it had to be changed. The renaming was the final step in the process of making the world safe for the new low-frequency economy. Not a safety measure, not a standard, something else, a filter for the inconvenient. The investigative essayist finds that the rhythmic sentence of the 1880s was often punctuated by the great exhibitions. In the renamed Expo districts of Melbourne and Sydney, the structures that are today called historical were once part of a much larger global network. The renaming of these districts in 1888 followed a predictable staccato pattern: the celebration of the new, the destruction of the old, and the rebranding of the remaining. The Centennial Park in Sydney, for instance, sits atop a massive underground reservoir system that predates the colony. When the park was renamed and dedicated, the history of the water system was retrofitted to fit the narrative of colonial progress, but the masonry of the tunnels is identical to the Tartarian structures of Russia and the Americas. The renaming was the psychological wall that prevented the public from seeing the continuity of the world. It made the past seem like a series of disconnected events rather than a single, unified civilization. In the renamed districts of the American West, the company towns of the 1880s represent the final frontier of the erasure. Towns like Pullman or Gary were designed from the ground up as renamed realities. They had no old world to erase because they were built on the ruins of Tartarian outposts that had been levelled a decade earlier. The naming of the streets after industry, Coal Street, Iron Avenue, Railroad Way, was a way to program the inhabitants. It was the staccato language of the machine applied to human geography. Ask yourself why the low distribution of the model houses in these towns is so much more robust than the materials require. It is because they were built using the recycled stone and metal of the previous era, repurposed and renamed to serve the factory. We are living in a world of hand-me-downs, told that everything is brand new and custom built for our comfort. The institutional erasure of the 1880s was not limited to the physical world. It extended into the very time we inhabit. The introduction of standard time in 1883 was the chronological equivalent of the renaming of the districts. It took the local, resonant time of the Earth and replaced it with a synchronized, mechanical time. The renaming of the hours and the zones allowed for the global coordination of the erasure. It ensured that the great levelling happened at the same time everywhere, preventing any one region from holding on to the truth. The staccato beat of the world's clocks became the heartbeat of the new order. We are the prisoners of a time that was renamed to make us more efficient, more predictable, and more forgetful. Not this, not that, something else. A rhythmic cage for the soul. In the shadows of the renamed districts of St. Petersburg, the urban explorer finds the silent spires. These are the towers that survived the 1880 renaming because they were too integral to the skyline to be removed, but they were stripped of their functionality. Their power was disconnected. The renaming of the districts around them to reflect the new imperial bureaucracy served to hide their original purpose as energy conductors. The pseudo-academic language of the time calls them fantasies or architectural whimsies, but a whimsy does not require a foundation that descends 60 feet into the permafrost. A whimsy does not utilize gold-plated copper for its roofing. The renaming was the shroud, the architecture is the evidence, and the institutional gatekeeping is the guard that stands at the door, telling us there is nothing to see here. The philosophical open loop of the 1880s renaming invites us to consider the power of a name. A name is a definition. A name is a boundary. By renaming the world, the architects of the 1880s redefined reality. They took a world of infinite possibility and turned it into a world of finite resources. They took a world of resonance and turned it into a world of noise. The staccato sentences of our modern lives are the echoes of that renaming. We speak in the language of the conqueror, wondering why we cannot hear the song of the earth. The investigation leads us to the realization that the renaming was not a historical event, but an ongoing process. Every time we accept a new label, every time we let the experts define our past, we are participating in the erasure. What if the Tartarian districts were not just renamed, but were actually relocated? Not the buildings, but the inhabitants. The records of the 1880s are full of relocation projects and population shifts. In the renamed industrial wards of the East Coast, the old families were replaced by new labourers who had no memory of the original names. This is the ultimate institutional gatekeeping, the replacement of the witness. If the people who knew the truth are gone, the lie becomes the truth by default. The renaming was the signal for the replacement to begin. We are the newcomers, living in the houses of the disappeared, calling them by the names given to us by the people who took them. The staccato pulse of our anxiety is the body's reaction to living in a stolen world. As I close this section of the investigation, the scale of the pattern becomes almost overwhelming. The renaming of the 1880s was a global rebranding of the human experience. It was the moment we were told that our history began with the steam engine and the telegraph, and that everything before it was darkness and superstition. But the stone remembers. The load distribution of the renamed districts tells a story of a civilization that understood the earth in a way we are no longer permitted to understand. The investigative essayist must continue to pull at the threads, even if the whole fabric of the modern world comes apart, because the truth is not in the names we were given, but in the silence that they were meant to hide. Not this, not that, something else. The transition from the physical to the digital erasure began in the renamed districts of the late 19th century, where the staccato rhythm of the emerging bureaucracy first learned to weaponize the ledger. In the renamed administrative quarters of Vienna and Budapest, the year 1889 saw a massive consolidation of property records into centralized vaults. These were the first black sites of historical data. The institutional gatekeeping was no longer just about the stone, it was about the paper. If the original deed, written in the old vernacular with the old Tartarian measurements, was replaced by a standardized, renamed certificate, the legal reality of the past ceased to exist. Ask yourself, why was the renaming so often preceded by a census of architectural features? They were inventorying the loot. They were identifying which structures could be retrofitted with the new metered technology and which had to be erased entirely to prevent the public from questioning the source of their power. Not an update, not a record, something else, a hit list for the past. In the renamed Maritime District of San Francisco, the load distribution of the piers remained a point of contention for independent surveyors well into the 1890s. The official history claimed these piers were built on wooden pilings during the gold rush, yet when the renaming boards arrived to designate the area as the Embarcadero, they found foundations of solid fused quartz that extended deep into the bay floor. The renaming was the cover for the capping of these structures. They were literally smothered in concrete and given a generic name to discourage further inquiry. The staccato beat of the jackhammer was the sound of the lid being closed. We are told this was modernization, but the pseudo-academic language of the era's engineering journals admits that the ancient foundations were far superior to the new caps. The renaming was a form of architectural gaslighting. It forced the eye to see a 19th century dock where a much older, more powerful energy terminal actually stood. The philosophical open loop of this erasure suggests that we are living in a demo version of reality. The 1880s renaming stripped away the high-fidelity details of the Tartarian world and replaced them with the low-resolution textures of the industrial age. We walk through renamed districts that are mere shadows of their former selves, using language that has been pruned of its resonant power. The investigative essayist realizes that the renaming was not just a historical event, but a spiritual downgrade. By changing the names of the districts, they changed the root directory of the human experience. We are no longer permitted to access the source code. We are only allowed to interact with the renamed interface. Not this, not that. Something else. A simulation of history, running on the hardware of a stolen world.